The bell above the shop door jingled sharply, catching everyone's attention as the poor man entered the brightly lit convenience store. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed from miles of walking, and his unshaven face bore the look of someone who had been weathered by life's hardships. All he wanted was a bottle of water and a small loaf of bread to quiet his growling stomach. But the shop owner, Mr. Reynolds, took one look at him and sneered. "Get out," he barked, pointing toward the door. "We don't serve beggars here." The man froze, his hand halfway to the rack of bread. "I'm not begging," he replied quietly. "I have money to pay." Mr. Reynolds stepped around the counter, towering over him. "Your kind doesn't belong here. Go find a shelter or whatever hole you crawled out of." The humiliation was palpable. The man's face flushed red, but he didn't argue further. With trembling hands, he pulled out a crumpled $20 bill from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "I just want the bread and water," he said softly, his voice almost breaking. Mr. Reynolds laughed cruelly and slapped the money back into the man's chest. "I don't care how much you have. Take your filth elsewhere." The poor man's eyes hardened, his posture straightening ever so slightly. He tucked the rejected money into his pocket, looked Mr. Reynolds square in the eye, and said, "You'll regret this." Without another word, he walked out of the store, leaving a stunned silence behind him. What happened next shook the entire town to its core. The poor man didn't just leave that store. He returned weeks later as its new owner. But that was only the beginning. It all began a few months prior, in the quiet town of Brookhaven. The poor man, whose name was Jack Monroe, wasn't always destitute. Once a successful entrepreneur, he had lost everything in a series of unfortunate events: a failed investment, a betrayal by his business partner, and an illness that drained his savings. Jack found himself homeless, wandering from town to town, clinging to hope but often greeted with disdain. Brookhaven wasn't much different from other places he'd been to. People stared as he walked by, his tattered coat flapping in the breeze. Some avoided him altogether, crossing the street or closing their doors when he came near. But Jack wasn't looking for pity or handouts. He was determined to get back on his feet, even if it meant starting small. He spent his days doing odd jobs, mowing lawns, cleaning gutters, and stacking boxes at the local market. The pay was meager, but he saved every penny he earned, always mindful of his goal: to rebuild his life. One evening, as Jack sat on a park bench eating a sandwich he had made from scraps given to him by a kind grocer, he overheard a conversation between two men. They were discussing Mr. Reynolds, the owner of the town's largest chain of convenience stores. "He's running the business into the ground," one man said. "His arrogance is costing him customers. Did you hear about the price hike last month? People are furious." The other man nodded. "Reynolds thinks he's untouchable. He's got more enemies than friends around here." Jack didn't think much of it at the time. He had no interest in gossip, especially about someone as wealthy and untouchable as Mr. Reynolds. He was focused on surviving the next day. But the encounter at the convenience store changed everything. When Jack walked out of the store that day, he wasn't just angry, he was inspired. He remembered the conversations he'd overheard in the park and began to see an opportunity. He didn't just want to prove Mr. Reynolds wrong. He wanted to show the entire town that kindness and respect mattered more than money. Jack spent the next few weeks working tirelessly. He tracked down old contacts, some of whom still remembered him as the sharp businessman he once was. With their help, he secured a small loan and began researching the failing chain. What he discovered shocked him. Mr. Reynolds was drowning in debt, and his stores were barely breaking even. Jack put together a plan. Using the loan and the money he had painstakingly saved, he bought out the bank's lien on one of the stores, ironically, the very same one where he had been humiliated. The rest of the chain, he learned, was up for sale too, but it would require more capital than he currently had. Still, Jack wasn't worried. He had a plan for that as well. When the paperwork was finalized, Jack walked back into the store, his head held high. The staff froze when they saw him, recognizing him immediately. Mr. Reynolds wasn't there, but Jack's presence sent a ripple of shock through the employees. "I'm the new owner," Jack announced calmly, placing the deed on the counter. "Things are going to change around here." Before anyone could process what was happening, the door jingled open, and Mr. Reynolds stormed in, his face red with rage. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking from Jack to the employees. Then his eyes fell on the deed, and his expression shifted from anger to disbelief. "You? How did you?" Mr. Reynolds stammered, unable to finish the sentence. Jack smiled faintly. "You told me to take my filth elsewhere. So I did. Now I own this place." Mr. Reynolds stood there, speechless, as Jack's words sank in. But Jack wasn't finished. "And this is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. The room was silent, everyone frozen in shock. No one could have imagined that the poor man they had once scorned would rise to such heights. But how had Jack managed to buy the store so quickly? What was his next move? And what would become of Mr. Reynolds now that the tables had turned? The answers were far more surprising than anyone could have predicted. The tension in the room was palpable as Jack locked eyes with Mr. Reynolds. For a moment, it seemed as though Reynolds might lash out, his face a storm of anger and confusion. But he said nothing, frozen in disbelief as Jack stood there, calm and resolute. Jack turned to the employees, who were still too stunned to speak. "You don't have to worry," he said gently. "Your jobs are safe. In fact, we're going to make this store better. For you, for the customers, for everyone." One of the cashiers, a young woman named Claire, finally found her voice. You're really the new owner?" Jack nodded. "I am. What about him?" Claire asked, nodding toward Mr. Reynolds, who was now gripping the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. Jack's eyes flicked back to Reynolds, his expression unreadable. "He's free to stay and shop, just like anyone else. But he doesn't get to call the shots anymore." Reynolds' face turned an even deeper shade of red, and he stormed out of the store without another word, slamming the door so hard that the bell rattled. Jack let out a small sigh of relief, but his focus quickly shifted back to the employees and customers. "Let's get back to work," he said with a reassuring smile. "We've got a lot to do." The news spread through Brookhaven like wildfire. By the end of the day, everyone in town knew about Jack Monroe's stunning purchase. The story of the poor man turned store owner was on everyone's lips, and opinions were divided. Some people were thrilled, seeing it as a victory for the underdog. Others were skeptical, doubting Jack's ability to turn the struggling store around. Jack didn't care about the gossip. He was too busy putting his plans into motion. The first thing he did was meet with the employees, listening to their concerns and ideas. They were hesitant at first, unsure if Jack's leadership would be any different from Reynolds. But Jack's genuine interest in their well-being quickly won them over. "We need to focus on the customers," Jack explained during a meeting in the break room. "People want to feel valued, not judged. Let's make this a place where everyone feels welcome." The employees nodded, some even smiling. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere under Reynolds, where fear and frustration had ruled. Jack also reached out to local suppliers, negotiating better deals and sourcing higher quality products. He introduced a loyalty program to attract more customers and lowered prices on essential items. It was a risky move, but Jack knew that earning the community's trust was worth the initial losses. A week later, Jack was sweeping the floor after closing when the doorbell jingled. He looked up, expecting one of the employees to have forgotten something, but it was Mr. Reynolds. The former owner stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Jack set the broom aside and crossed his arms. "What do you want, Reynolds?" Reynolds took a step inside, his shoulders stiff. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything?" Jack stayed calm. "I don't think I've won anything. I just want to make this place better." Reynolds snorted. "Better? You've got no idea what you're doing. This business isn't some charity. It's about profit, and you're throwing money away with your little stunts." "Maybe," Jack admitted, "but it's not just about money. It's about people, something you forgot a long time ago." For a moment, it seemed like Reynolds might argue, but then he simply shook his head and turned to leave. Before he walked out, he paused and said, "You won't last 6 months. This place will chew you up and spit you out." Jack didn't respond. He simply watched Reynolds go, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The next day, things took an unexpected turn. A delivery truck arrived early in the morning, bringing fresh produce, baked goods, and other supplies. The employees were excited to see the new stock, and customers began trickling in shortly after the store opened. But by mid-morning, trouble struck. One of the cash registers broke down, causing long lines and frustrated customers. To make matters worse, the delivery driver returned, claiming that a box of inventory had been left on the truck by mistake. Jack scrambled to handle the chaos, apologizing to customers and helping to ring up items manually. As the day dragged on, Jack started to feel the weight of his decision. The store was more than just a business. It was a whirlwind of moving parts, each one demanding attention. He hadn't realized how much work it would take to keep everything running smoothly. By evening, Jack was exhausted but determined. He gathered the employees for another meeting, thanking them for their hard work and addressing the day's challenges. "We'll get better," he promised. "This was just a bump in the road." Claire, the cashier, spoke up. "You handled it pretty well, Jack. I think we all believe in what you're trying to do here." The words lifted Jack's spirits, and he went home that night feeling a renewed sense of purpose. But the next day brought a shock that no one saw coming. Jack arrived at the store early, as usual, only to find a crowd gathered outside. At first, he thought it was just a group of curious customers, but as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The front window of the store had been shattered, and graffiti covered the walls. "Go back where you came from," one message read, written in bold red letters. Jack's stomach sank. Who would do something like this? And why? The employees arrived one by one, their faces falling as they saw the damage. Jack knew this was more than just vandalism. It was a message. Someone didn't want him here. Jack took a deep breath and turned to the employees. "We're not going to let this stop us," he said firmly. "Let's clean up and keep moving forward." But as they began to assess the damage, a troubling question lingered in Jack's mind. Was this just the beginning of something worse? The sun rose higher as Jack and his team swept up the shards of glass and scrubbed the graffiti from the walls. The messages were cruel, filled with anger and hatred, but Jack didn't let his frustration show. He needed to stay strong, both for himself and for the employees who were beginning to trust him. By mid-morning, the cleanup was mostly done, and Jack stood back to survey the store. The broken window had been boarded up temporarily, but the scars of the vandalism lingered in the air. Customers approached cautiously, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Claire approached Jack with a clipboard in hand. "The repairs are going to cost us," she said, biting her lip, "and replacing the window won't be cheap." Jack nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "We'll figure it out. Right now, I just want to make sure people feel safe coming here." But as the day wore on, it became clear that the vandalism had scared off some of the regulars. Sales were down, and the employees seemed on edge. Jack felt the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he refused to give up. That evening, Jack sat at the counter with a notebook, jotting down ideas for how to bounce back. He was so focused that he didn't notice the bell above the door jingling until a voice broke the silence. "Rough day?" Jack looked up to see an elderly man with kind eyes and a warm smile. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, and he carried a brown paper bag under one arm. "You could say that," Jack replied, setting down his pen. "But we'll manage." The man nodded, taking a seat at the counter. "Name's Henry. I've been coming to this store for years, back when it was just a tiny little shop." Jack extended a hand. "Jack Monroe. Nice to meet you, Henry." Henry shook his hand firmly. "I heard about what happened this morning. Figured I'd stop by and see how you're holding up." Jack smiled faintly. "I appreciate that. It's been a rough start, but I'm not giving up." Henry leaned back in his chair, studying Jack for a moment. "You remind me of my father. He used to say, 'You can't stop the wind from blowing, but you can always adjust your sails.' Sounds like you're doing just that." Jack chuckled softly. "Something like that." Henry reached into the paper bag and pulled out a thermos and 2 cups. "Well, how about some coffee? You look like you could use it." Jack accepted gratefully, pouring himself a cup. As they sipped their drinks, Henry shared stories about the town and its people, painting a picture of a community that was both tight-knit and wary of outsiders. Jack listened intently, soaking in every word. "You've got your work cut out for you," Henry said finally, "but I think you've got the heart for it. Just don't let them scare you off." Jack nodded, feeling a spark of hope reignite in his chest. I won't. The next morning, Jack arrived at the store with a renewed sense of purpose. He posted a sign on the boarded-up window that read, "Hate won't stop us. Everyone is welcome here." Customers began trickling in, some of them stopping to read the sign before entering. Many nodded in approval, and a few even offered words of encouragement. By mid-afternoon, things were starting to look up. Sales were steady, and the employees seemed more relaxed. Jack was manning the counter when a young boy approached, clutching a few crumpled dollar bills. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said shyly. "Can I buy this?" He held up a small pack of gum, his wide eyes filled with hope. Jack smiled and rang up the purchase, making sure to give the boy exact change. "Thanks, mister," the boy said, grinning as he ran out the door. Jack watched him go, feeling a flicker of joy. Moments like these reminded him why he was doing this, why he was fighting to turn the store into something more than just a business. But just as things were starting to settle, disaster struck again. Late that night, Jack was locking up the store when he heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. He spun around to see a brick sailing through the boarded-up window, landing with a loud thud inside the store. Jack rushed toward the door, but whoever had thrown the brick was already gone, disappearing into the shadows. Jack's heart raced as he surveyed the damage. The brick had smashed through the plywood, leaving another gaping hole in the front of the store. Attached to it was a note, hastily scrawled in large, jagged letters. "This is your last warning. Leave." Jack clenched his fists, anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. He didn't know who was behind the attacks, but it was clear they weren't going to stop anytime soon. As he stood there in the cold night air, staring at the vandal's message, a question burned in his mind. How far were they willing to go? And how much more could he endure? Jack stared at the threatening note, his chest tight with a mix of fear and determination. He carefully removed the brick from the shattered window, crumpling the note and stuffing it into his pocket. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the quiet streets, but whoever had done this was long gone. Jack knew one thing for sure. He couldn't handle this alone. The next morning, he called a meeting with his employees before the store opened. They gathered in the break room, their faces clouded with worry. "This isn't just about a broken window," Jack began, holding up the crumpled note. "Someone wants us out, and they're not afraid to use threats or violence to make it happen." Claire frowned. "But why? What could anyone have against you? Or this store?" Jack sighed. "I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm new here. Maybe it's because we're trying to change things. Whatever the reason, we can't let them win." "What do we do?" asked one of the stock boys, his voice shaky. Jack leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "First, we're installing security cameras. If they come back, we'll catch them on tape. Second, we're going to stand together. This store is more than just a place to buy groceries. It's a part of this community, and we're going to show them that it's worth fighting for." The employees nodded, some hesitantly, others with quiet resolve. Claire spoke up, her voice steady. "We're with you, Jack. Whatever it takes." By midday, Jack had contacted a local security company and arranged for cameras to be installed around the store. It was another expense he hadn't planned for, but he knew it was necessary. As the technicians worked, customers came and went, many of them stopping to ask about the damage. "What happened?" asked Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman who had been a regular at the store for years. "Just some troublemakers," Jack replied, forcing a smile. "But we're not going anywhere." Mrs. Carter patted his arm. "Good for you, dear. This town could use more people like you." Her words gave Jack a small boost of confidence, but as the day went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. That night, Jack stayed at the store long after closing, determined to catch up on paperwork and keep an eye on things. The security cameras were up and running, their tiny red lights blinking reassuringly in the darkness. Jack reviewed the footage from earlier in the day, making sure everything was working properly. Around midnight, he decided to call it a night. As he was locking the front door, he noticed something strange, a shadow moving across the parking lot. He froze, his heart pounding, and watched as a figure emerged from behind a parked car. The person was dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hood. They crept toward the store, a spray can in hand. Jack's blood boiled. Whoever this was, they were brazen enough to return after everything that had already happened. Jack slipped back inside and watched the intruder from the safety of the security monitors. The cameras captured the figure as they approached the side wall of the store and began spraying graffiti. Jack could just make out the words they were painting. "You don't belong here." Anger surged through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He reached for his phone and dialed the local police. "This is Jack Monroe at Brookhaven Market," he whispered. "There's someone vandalizing my store right now. Can you send someone over?" The dispatcher assured him that an officer was on the way. Jack hung up and continued watching the monitors, his jaw clenched. He wanted to confront the vandal himself, but he knew it was safer to wait for the police. A few tense minutes later, red and blue lights flashed in the parking lot, and the sound of a siren pierced the air. The vandal froze, dropping the spray can and attempting to run, but the officer was quick, cutting them off and tackling them to the ground. Jack stepped outside as the officer cuffed the intruder. The hood fell back, revealing a teenage boy with messy blonde hair and a face flushed with panic. "Why are you doing this?" Jack asked, his voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. The boy avoided his gaze, muttering, "I don't know. I was told to." "Told to?" Jack pressed, his eyes narrowing. "By who?" The boy clamped his mouth shut, refusing to answer. The officer escorted him to the squad car, leaving Jack standing in the cold night air, his mind racing. Who could have orchestrated this? And why were they targeting him so relentlessly? The next day, the town buzzed with news of the arrest. Some people applauded Jack for standing his ground, while others whispered about the boy and who might have put him up to it. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the tip of the iceberg. As he reviewed the footage from the security cameras, he noticed something he hadn't seen the night before. A second figure lurking in the shadows, just out of the camera's range. The person disappeared as soon as the police arrived, but Jack was certain of one thing. They weren't working alone. Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind churning. Whoever was behind this was still out there, and they weren't finished. His determination hardened. If they wanted a fight, he was ready to give them one. Jack spent the morning reviewing the security footage again and again, pausing and rewinding the clip to study the second figure lurking in the shadows. The hooded vandal who'd been caught might have been the one holding the spray can, but this second person was the puppet master, observing from the darkness and pulling the strings. Who were they? And why were they going to such lengths to drive him out? Jack knew he couldn't wait for answers to fall into his lap. He had to take action. The first step was ensuring the safety of his store, employees, and customers. The second was getting to the root of who was orchestrating these attacks. The tension in town was palpable. News of the arrest spread fast, and while some customers expressed sympathy and support, others were more guarded, their curiosity tinged with unease. "What's really going on here, Jack?" asked a man in his 40s, his arms crossed as he waited for his receipt. "You've been here, what, a few weeks? And already someone's out to get you?" "I wish I knew," Jack replied evenly, handing over the receipt. "But I'm not going anywhere, no matter what they throw at me." The man nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. Jack could feel the unspoken doubts hanging in the air. Some people wondered if he'd brought trouble to their quiet town, and that suspicion only fueled Jack's determination to prove them wrong. Later that evening, Jack received a call from Officer Daniels, the cop who had arrested the teen vandal. "Got a minute?" Daniels asked. His voice was low, almost cautious. "Of course," Jack replied, his pulse quickening. Daniels sighed. "We questioned the kid, but he's clammed up. He won't tell us who put him up to it. But we found something in his pocket that might interest you." "What is it?" "A business card. Blank on the front except for the initials MR and a phone number." Jack's stomach dropped. "MR? You think it's—" "I think it's worth looking into," Daniels said. "Does the name ring any bells?" Jack's mind raced. There was only one person he could think of with those initials. Martin Reynolds, the former owner of the store and the man who had humiliated him weeks ago. It was no secret that Reynolds had taken Jack's sudden rise personally, but could he really be behind this? "I'll handle it," Jack said, his voice firm. Jack didn't waste any time. The next morning, he marched into Reynolds' office. The man was still technically the owner of the other stores in the chain, though rumors were swirling that he was struggling to keep them afloat. Reynolds looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to disdain. Well, if it isn't the town hero," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What brings you here?" Jack didn't bother with pleasantries. He pulled the crumpled note from his pocket and slapped it onto Reynolds' desk. "This and this." He tossed down the security footage stills, highlighting the second figure. "I want to know if this is your doing." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," Jack snapped. "The vandalism, the threats, your initials are all over it. And don't think I've forgotten the way you treated me the first time I stepped into that store." Reynolds smirked, but there was something calculating in his eyes. "You think I'm behind this? Please, I don't need to waste my time on you." "Then explain the card," Jack shot back. "And explain why someone's been targeting me from the moment I took over." Reynolds leaned forward, his smirk fading. "Listen, Monroe, I don't know what you think you're proving, but this town doesn't want you here. You're an outsider, and outsiders never last. So if you're smart, you'll take the hint and leave before things get worse." Jack clenched his fists, but he refused to let Reynolds get under his skin. "You can try to scare me all you want, but I'm not going anywhere." Reynolds shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." As Jack left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that Reynolds was hiding something. The man might not have admitted to orchestrating the attacks, but his smug demeanor and veiled threats only made Jack more certain that he was involved. Jack's suspicions were confirmed later that evening when he received an anonymous text message. It read, "You should have listened to Reynolds. Now you'll pay the price." Jack stared at the message, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just a fight for his store anymore. It was personal. Someone was trying to drive him out, and they were willing to escalate their tactics to do it. The next day, Jack arrived at the store early, his mind racing with plans to protect the business and uncover the truth. But as he unlocked the door, he was greeted by a sickening sight. The shelves had been ransacked, the cash register smashed, and inventory strewn across the floor. The smell of spilled milk and rotting produce filled the air. Whoever had done this hadn't just vandalized the store. They'd broken in and destroyed everything in sight. Jack's heart sank as he surveyed the damage. This wasn't a random act of anger. It was a calculated strike, meant to cripple him financially and emotionally. Claire arrived minutes later, gasping as she saw the destruction. "Jack, what are we going to do?" Jack's hands balled into fists. "We're going to clean this up, fix what's broken, and keep moving forward." "But what if it happens again?" another employee asked, their voice trembling. Jack turned to his team, his eyes blazing with determination. "It won't. Whoever's behind this thinks they can scare us into giving up. But they're wrong. This store is more than just a building. It's a symbol of what we stand for. And I'm not letting anyone take that away." As the employees began the long process of cleaning up, Jack stepped outside to make a call. His voice was steady, but his resolve had never been stronger. "Officer Daniels? It's Jack. I need your help. I think I know who's behind this." Jack ended the call and stared at the boarded-up window, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for justice. Jack stood outside the store, phone still in hand, his mind racing with strategies. The store was in shambles, but giving up wasn't an option. Whoever was behind the attack had underestimated his determination. Jack wasn't just fighting for the store. He was fighting to prove that decency, perseverance, and integrity could overcome greed and malice. Within an hour, Officer Daniels arrived, stepping out of his patrol car with a notebook in hand. His expression darkened as he surveyed the damage. "Looks like they really wanted to send a message," Daniels said grimly. Jack nodded. "It's not just about the store. Someone's trying to make this personal." Daniels stepped inside, taking notes as he walked through the aisles, now littered with destroyed merchandise. "You said you suspect Reynolds?" Jack leaned against the counter, his frustration boiling over. "I don't have direct proof yet, but everything points to him. The business card we found, the threats, the way he acted when I confronted him. It's too much to be a coincidence." Daniels looked thoughtful. We'll investigate. But Reynolds is a slippery one, and without hard evidence, it'll be tough to tie him to this. Jack clenched his fists. Then I'll get the evidence. Daniels raised an eyebrow. Jack, I get it. You're passionate about this. But be careful. Whoever's behind this clearly isn't afraid to escalate. Jack met Daniels' gaze, his voice steady. I'm not afraid of them. I just want the truth. The employees rallied behind Jack as they cleaned up the mess. Claire, always the optimist, worked tirelessly alongside him, reassuring customers who stopped by to check on the store. We'll reopen soon, Claire told one elderly woman, her smile unwavering. Jack's got big plans. The words warmed Jack's heart, but he couldn't ignore the growing weight on his shoulders. Every setback seemed designed to break him, yet here he was, still standing. By the end of the day, most of the damage had been repaired, but the store's shelves were still half empty, and the boarded-up windows served as a grim reminder of the attacks. Jack stayed late into the night, poring over the security footage in search of clues. Around midnight, Jack's persistence paid off. As he reviewed the footage from the night of the break-in, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A distinct logo on the back of the intruder's jacket. It was small and partially obscured, but Jack recognized it instantly. It was the emblem of one of Reynolds' other stores. Jack's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a random act of vandalism. It was coordinated, and the connection to Reynolds was undeniable. Jack grabbed his phone and dialed Officer Daniels. I've got something, he said, his voice tinged with urgency. The person who broke in was wearing a jacket with Reynolds' store logo on it. Daniels was silent for a moment. That's something we can work with. Send me the footage. Jack uploaded the file and sent it to Daniels immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his heart racing. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a start. The next day, Jack walked into the store to find a small crowd gathered outside. Word of the break-in had spread, and customers were eager to show their support. Some brought flowers, others handed over baked goods or small notes of encouragement. One man, a middle-aged carpenter named Tom, stepped forward and shook Jack's hand. Heard about what happened. Figured you could use some help. Jack smiled, grateful for the offer. Thanks, Tom. We could definitely use an extra pair of hands. Tom spent the day repairing the remaining damage, replacing broken shelves and patching up holes. His kindness inspired others in the community to pitch in, and by the afternoon, the store was looking better than it had in weeks. But as Jack watched the repairs progress, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. If Reynolds was truly behind the attacks, what would he do next? And how far was he willing to go? That night, Jack's worst fears were realized. He was locking up the store when his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It read, "You should have listened. Now we're coming for more than just your store." Jack's blood ran cold. He looked around the dark parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching him, but it was empty. The text was a warning and a promise. Whoever was behind this wasn't done yet. Jack immediately called Daniels, his voice urgent. They've escalated. I just got another threat. Daniels swore under his breath. This is getting out of hand. Do you have any idea what they mean by more than just your store? Jack's jaw tightened. No, but I'm not waiting to find out. Daniels sighed. I'll file this. But Jack, you need to be careful. These people clearly don't play by the rules. I know, Jack said, his voice firm. But I'm not backing down. The next morning, Jack arrived at the store to find a chilling sight. The back wall of the building was covered in graffiti, even more hateful and violent than before. But it wasn't just the words that shook him. It was the addition of a crudely drawn symbol that Jack recognized from his research into Reynolds' businesses. It was the logo of a private security firm Reynolds had once hired for his stores. This was no longer a matter of suspicion. Reynolds' fingerprints were all over the attacks, and Jack finally had the evidence to prove it. But as Jack stared at the graffiti, a terrible thought crossed his mind. If they were willing to go this far, what else were they capable of? Jack stood frozen, staring at the graffiti on the back wall. The crude symbol, tied unmistakably to Reynolds' past dealings, felt like a declaration of war. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate him. They were leaving breadcrumbs, almost daring him to confront them. Claire arrived moments later, gasping as she saw the defaced wall. Jack, what does that mean? She asked, pointing to the symbol. It means Reynolds isn't even trying to hide anymore, Jack said, his voice tight with anger. He's practically bragging. Claire frowned, crossing her arms. What are you going to do? Jack clenched his fists. I'm going to fight back. Jack wasted no time. He called Officer Daniels again, updating him on the latest attack. Daniels arrived at the scene within the hour, his expression dark as he examined the graffiti. This is escalating quickly, Daniels muttered, taking pictures of the wall. We've got enough to question Reynolds, but he's slippery. Don't expect him to just confess. I don't need a confession, Jack said firmly. I need this to stop. Daniels nodded, scribbling in his notebook. We'll do what we can, but be careful. Pushing Reynolds might provoke him even more. Jack didn't care about Reynolds' threats anymore. He was done playing defense. That afternoon, Jack made his way to Reynolds' main office. It was located in a sleek, modern building on the other side of town, a stark contrast to the struggling stores he still owned. Jack stepped inside, his jaw set as he approached the receptionist. I need to speak to Martin Reynolds, he said. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced smile, glanced at her computer screen. Do you have an appointment? No, Jack replied, his voice sharp. But he'll want to see me. The woman hesitated, but eventually picked up the phone. Moments later, she gestured toward a set of glass doors. He's in the conference room. Jack pushed through the doors, his footsteps echoing in the spacious office. Reynolds was seated at the head of a long table, his fingers tapping lazily against the surface. He didn't look surprised to see Jack. Well, if it isn't Brookhaven's new hero, Reynolds said with a smirk. What can I do for you, Monroe? Jack didn't waste time on pleasantries. He pulled out his phone and played the security footage, pausing to zoom in on the logo on the vandal's jacket. Explain this. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. What am I looking at? Don't play dumb, Jack snapped. That logo is from one of your stores. And that symbol they spray-painted? It's connected to the security firm you hired years ago. You're behind this. Reynolds' expression didn't waver. That's quite the accusation. Got any actual proof? Or are you just here to waste my time? Jack stepped closer, his voice low and steady. You've been trying to scare me off since the day I took over that store. You humiliated me, you sent vandals to destroy my business, and now you're threatening my safety. But here's the thing, Reynolds. I'm not afraid of you. Reynolds chuckled, shaking his head. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you when this town finally turns its back on you. Jack leaned in, his eyes blazing. This town deserves better than you, and I'm going to make sure they see it. Reynolds' smirk faltered for the first time, but he quickly recovered, waving a dismissive hand. Run along, Monroe. Play your little games. We'll see who's still standing in the end. Jack left the office more determined than ever. Reynolds might have brushed him off, but Jack had seen the crack in his armor. The man was rattled, even if he wouldn't admit it. That night, Jack called another meeting with his employees. They gathered in the break room, their expressions tense but hopeful. Reynolds isn't stopping, Jack said, addressing the group. He's determined to run us out of town, and he's not afraid to get his hands dirty. But we're not going to let him win. Claire nodded, her voice firm. We're with you, Jack. The others murmured their agreement, their resolve growing stronger with each word Jack spoke. We're going to fight back, Jack continued. Not with threats or vandalism, but by showing this town what we stand for. We'll rebuild the store. We'll keep our doors open, and we'll prove to everyone that kindness and hard work can outlast hatred. The employees erupted into applause, their spirits lifted by Jack's determination. But as they left the meeting, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The next morning, Jack was up before dawn, preparing to reopen the store. He had barely finished stocking the shelves when a loud bang echoed through the air, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Jack ran outside, his heart pounding. A car was speeding away, its tires screeching as it disappeared down the street. The store's front window had been completely destroyed, shards of glass littering the sidewalk. This wasn't just a warning. It was an escalation, and it was clear Reynolds, or whoever was behind this, wasn't holding back anymore. Jack clenched his fists, staring at the destruction. This wasn't just about a store anymore. It was about standing up to the people who thought they could bully their way to power. And Jack was ready for the fight. The shards of broken glass sparkled in the early morning light, but there was nothing beautiful about the destruction. Jack stood in the doorway, his jaw tight as the employees arrived one by one, their faces painted with shock and concern. "They're not stopping, are they?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Jack replied, his voice calm but resolute. "And neither are we." Before he could say more, a police cruiser pulled up, and Officer Daniels stepped out, shaking his head as he surveyed the damage. "Another hit," Daniels muttered, pulling out his notebook. "This is getting out of hand." Jack gestured toward the fleeing car's path. "They sped off before I could see the plates, but this was no random act." Daniels sighed, jotting down details. "We're building a case, Jack, but whoever's behind this knows how to cover their tracks. I'll check for traffic cameras, but don't get your hopes up." Jack nodded, his mind already racing with the next steps. "I'm not waiting around for them to strike again." Daniels gave him a wary look. "What are you planning?" Jack met his gaze, his voice steady. "I'm going to show this town exactly who Reynolds is." The employees worked tirelessly to clean up the mess, boarding up the window and sweeping away the glass. Despite the setback, the store opened on time, and Jack greeted each customer with a smile, refusing to let the vandalism dampen the store's spirit. Word of the latest attack spread quickly, and more people came in to show their support. Some offered words of encouragement, while others expressed outrage at the escalating violence. Among them was Henry, the elderly man who had befriended Jack early on. "Looks like they're trying to break you," Henry said, leaning on his cane as he watched Jack restock shelves. "They can try," Jack replied, "but this store is bigger than me. It's about proving that this town deserves better." Henry nodded, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "You've got the right idea, Jack. Keep at it." By late afternoon, Jack had a plan. He called a local journalist, Megan Carter, who had been covering the story of the vandalism. Megan had been skeptical of Jack at first, but the attacks had piqued her interest. "What's this about, Jack?" Megan asked when she arrived at the store, notebook in hand. "I have something to show you," Jack said, leading her to his office. He pulled up the security footage, pausing on the frame that showed the vandal wearing the jacket with Reynolds' logo. Megan leaned in, her brow furrowed. "That's a bold connection. You're saying Reynolds is behind this?" "I'm saying it's more than a coincidence," Jack replied. "And this isn't just about my store. It's about a man who's been exploiting this town for years." Megan raised an eyebrow. "That's a big accusation. Do you have more?" Jack nodded, pulling out a folder of documents he'd collected. They detailed Reynolds' history of underhanded business practices, including his use of intimidation tactics to drive out competitors. Megan flipped through the papers, her expression shifting from skepticism to intrigue. "If this checks out, it's a big story. But you realize Reynolds isn't going to go down without a fight." Jack's eyes hardened. "Neither am I." The article was published the next day, and it hit Brookhaven like a thunderbolt. Megan's piece detailed not only the attacks on Jack's store, but also Reynolds' history of unethical behavior. The story included quotes from former employees, local business owners, and even customers who had felt the sting of Reynolds' tactics. Reynolds' name was suddenly on everyone's lips, and not in a good way. The response was immediate. Some people called for boycotts of Reynolds' remaining stores, while others rallied around Jack, seeing him as a symbol of resistance against corruption. Customers poured into Jack's store, not just to shop, but to show their support. But as Jack basked in the outpouring of community solidarity, he couldn't shake the feeling that Reynolds wouldn't take this lying down. That night, Jack's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" A familiar voice crackled through the line. It was Reynolds. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Reynolds said, his tone icy. "Dragging my name through the mud like that." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. "The truth hurts, doesn't it?" Reynolds let out a low chuckle. "You've made a big mistake, Monroe. You think you've won, but this is far from over." "I'm not afraid of you," Jack said firmly. "You should be," Reynolds replied, his voice darkening. "Because the next time I make a move, you won't see it coming." The line went dead, leaving Jack staring at the phone, his heart pounding. The next day, Jack arrived at the store early, determined to stay one step ahead of Reynolds. But as he unlocked the door, he was met with an even greater shock. The shelves were bare, the cash registers emptied, and the storeroom ransacked. Whoever had done this hadn't just vandalized the store, they'd stolen everything of value. Claire arrived moments later, gasping as she saw the devastation. "Jack, what do we do now?" Jack stared at the empty shelves, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't a random burglary. This was Reynolds making good on his threat. But as the anger rose in his chest, it was quickly replaced by something stronger: resolve. "We rebuild," Jack said firmly, "and we fight back harder." But deep down, Jack knew the battle had reached a breaking point. Reynolds wasn't going to stop until Jack was broken, or until Jack found a way to beat him once and for all. The sight of the empty store hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He had expected another attack, but not on this scale. This wasn't just an act of vandalism. It was an assault on everything he had worked to build. Yet even as frustration churned in his chest, Jack refused to crumble. He turned to Claire, who stood frozen in shock. "Call the others," he said calmly. "Tell them to come in. We're cleaning this up." Claire nodded, her voice shaky. "But what about the inventory? The cash? How do we—" "We'll figure it out," Jack interrupted, determination flickering in his eyes. "Reynolds wants us to fold, but we're not giving him the satisfaction." By mid-morning, the employees had gathered at the store. They worked in grim silence, sweeping the floors and reorganizing what little was left. The atmosphere was heavy, but Jack's steady resolve gave them a reason to keep going. As they cleaned, customers began arriving, their faces filled with concern. Word of the break-in had spread quickly, and many came not to shop but to offer their help. "I've got some spare supplies at home," said Mrs. Carter, holding a basket of fresh-baked bread. "You can have them to restock the shelves." "I'll donate my time to help with repairs," offered Tom, the carpenter who had previously fixed the store's shelving. One by one, the community rallied around Jack. They brought food, supplies, and words of encouragement, their actions a testament to the impact Jack had made in such a short time. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. But Jack knew that goodwill alone wouldn't be enough. The store needed inventory, and fast. That afternoon, he sat in his office, poring over his budget and calling suppliers. Most were sympathetic, but hesitant to extend credit after hearing about the break-in. Jack's options were dwindling. Then his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Megan Carter, the journalist who had written the article exposing Reynolds. "Jack, I've got news," Megan said, her voice urgent. "The story about Reynolds is blowing up. A local TV station wants to cover it. They're asking for an interview with you." Jack hesitated. The idea of going on TV made him uneasy, but this was an opportunity to amplify his message and gain even more community support. "When's the interview?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," Megan replied. "They want to film it at the store." Jack nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "Tell them I'll do it." That evening, Jack gathered his team for a meeting. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day," he began, explaining the interview. "This is our chance to show the world what we're fighting for." The employees exchanged nervous glances. "What if Reynolds retaliates again?" Claire asked. "He probably will," Jack admitted. "But we can't let fear stop us. This store is about more than just business. It's about standing up for what's right. And the more people know our story, the harder it'll be for Reynolds to get away with this." The team nodded, their resolve renewed. The next morning, the TV crew arrived early to set up their equipment. Jack stood outside the store, watching as they positioned cameras and microphones. Customers and passers-by gathered nearby, curious about the commotion. When the cameras began rolling, Jack stood in front of the store, his voice steady as he recounted the struggles he had faced. "This store isn't just mine," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "It belongs to this community. People deserve a place where they're treated with respect and kindness, no matter who they are. That's what we're fighting for." The interviewer leaned forward. "What do you say to the people who claim these attacks are connected to Martin Reynolds?" Jack didn't flinch. "I say they're right. Reynolds has been trying to drive me out since the day I took over this store. But no matter what he throws at us, "We're not backing down." The interview aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. Calls and messages flooded the store from people across the region, offering support and donations. Some even pledged to boycott Reynolds' businesses. But while the community's support grew, so did the tension. That night, as Jack closed up the store, his phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "You're making a lot of noise, Monroe. Time to end this." Jack stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The threat was clear, and it was a promise that Reynolds, or whoever was behind the attacks, wouldn't let up. The next day brought another shocking development. A lawyer arrived at the store, carrying a letter addressed to Jack. The letter was a cease and desist order, accusing Jack of defamation and demanding that he retract his statements about Reynolds. Jack read the letter twice, his anger growing with each word. This wasn't just a legal threat. It was Reynolds' latest attempt to silence him. "What are you going to do?" Claire asked, her voice filled with worry. Jack folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. "I'm going to fight," he said simply. But as Jack prepared for the battle ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that Reynolds' next move would be even more dangerous. The war wasn't just about a store anymore. It was about survival. The cease and desist letter was a warning, but Jack saw it for what it truly was, an act of desperation. Reynolds was feeling the heat. The interview had brought Jack's story into the spotlight, and the community's growing support made it harder for Reynolds to operate in the shadows. Jack met with Megan Carter that afternoon to discuss the letter. She was outraged. "This is a classic Reynolds move," she said, flipping through the document. "He's trying to intimidate you into silence." "Well, it's not going to work," Jack said firmly. "I'm not backing down." Megan nodded, her expression resolute. "Good. Because if he's resorting to legal threats, it means he's running out of options." That evening, Jack called a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Linda who had a reputation for standing up to corporate bullies. "Reynolds is grasping at straws," Linda said after reviewing the letter. "He doesn't have a case. Everything you've said is backed by evidence, and the public support you've gained puts him in a tough spot. So what's the next move?" Jack asked. Linda leaned back in her chair. "We counter. I'll file a formal response rejecting his claims. But be prepared. This might push him to escalate." Jack nodded. "Let him. I'll be ready." The next few days passed without incident, but Jack knew better than to let his guard down. He poured his energy into rebuilding the store, working alongside his employees to restock shelves and restore the space. Donations continued to pour in, both from locals and from people who had seen his story on TV. The store was buzzing with activity when Claire approached Jack, holding her phone. "You need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. She handed him the phone, and Jack's stomach dropped as he read the headline. "Jack Monroe's store targeted again. Community icon under fire." The article detailed another break-in, but this time it wasn't at Jack's store. It was at the homes of two employees. Jack called an emergency meeting that night, gathering his team in the break room. Tension hung thick in the air as they discussed the escalating attacks. "They're targeting us now," said Tom, the carpenter. "This isn't just about the store anymore." Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, and I'm sorry you've been dragged into this." "It's not your fault," Claire said firmly. "Reynolds is the one behind this." Jack leaned forward, his voice steady. "We need to stay strong. If we back down now, he wins. But if any of you feel unsafe, I understand if you want to step away." The room fell silent, and then Claire spoke. "We're not going anywhere, Jack. We believe in what you're doing." The others murmured their agreement, and Jack felt a surge of gratitude. Despite everything, his team was standing by him. The next day, Jack took his fight directly to Reynolds. Armed with Linda's advice and a folder of evidence, he marched into the courthouse and filed a lawsuit against Reynolds for harassment, intimidation, and damages to the store. It was a bold move, but Jack was done playing defense. The news of the lawsuit spread quickly, and it sent shockwaves through Brookhaven. Reynolds responded with fury, releasing a statement denying any involvement and accusing Jack of orchestrating the attacks for publicity. But the community wasn't buying it. Customers continued to flock to Jack's store, and more people came forward with stories about Reynolds' shady dealings. Megan Carter published another expose, this time detailing the long history of Reynolds' intimidation tactics. That evening, Jack arrived home late, exhausted but determined. As he unlocked his door, he noticed something strange. The light inside his living room was on. His pulse quickened as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Everything seemed untouched, until he saw the note on the coffee table. "You're playing a dangerous game, Monroe. Back off, or this won't end well." Jack's blood ran cold. Someone had broken into his home, and the message was clear. Reynolds, or whoever was behind this, was willing to cross any line to stop him. Jack immediately called Linda and Officer Daniels, his hands trembling as he recounted the incident. "This is serious," Daniels said, his tone grim. "Whoever did this isn't just trying to scare you. They're escalating." "We'll add this to the lawsuit," Linda said. "It strengthens your case, but you need to be careful, Jack. This is more than just a legal battle now." Jack nodded, his mind racing. The break-in was a stark reminder that this fight wasn't just about his business anymore. It was personal, and the stakes were higher than ever. As he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, one thought consumed him. How far was Reynolds willing to go? And what would it take to finally bring him down? The break-in at Jack's home was the most brazen attack yet. It was no longer just about intimidation. It was about fear. Jack knew he couldn't let it show. If he backed down now, Reynolds and his cronies would win. The next morning, Jack arrived at the store earlier than usual, his mind racing with plans. He met with Officer Daniels, who had assigned a patrol car to keep an eye on the store overnight. But Jack knew the situation required more than just police presence. As the day unfolded, Jack made a bold decision. He would take the fight to Reynolds in a way no one would expect. He reached out to Megan Carter with a proposal. "Megan," Jack said over the phone, "I want to hold a town hall meeting." Megan paused. "A town hall? What for?" "To tell the truth," Jack replied. "To lay everything out for the community. What's happening, who's behind it, and why we're not giving up. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about standing up to the kind of people who think they can bully their way to the top." Megan was silent for a moment, then said, "If you do this, you'll be putting yourself in an even bigger spotlight. Are you ready for that?" Jack didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." The town hall was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community center. Word spread quickly, and by the time the day arrived, the room was packed with people, customers, supporters, and even those who were skeptical of Jack's claims. Jack stood at the front of the room, a microphone in hand, his heart pounding as he looked out at the crowd. Megan stood nearby, recording the event for her next story. "Thank you all for coming," Jack began, his voice steady. "Many of you know me as the owner of Brookhaven Market. But what you might not know is the fight that's been happening behind the scenes." He recounted the vandalism, the break-ins, and the threats, showing photos and security footage as evidence. Gasps rippled through the audience as he played the clip of the vandal wearing the jacket with Reynolds' logo. "This isn't just about a store," Jack continued. "It's about standing up to people who think they can crush others to get ahead. It's about proving that kindness, hard work, and integrity still matter." The room erupted in applause, but Jack wasn't finished. He held up a folder containing the lawsuit he had filed. "This is my next step, holding Martin Reynolds accountable for everything he's done, not just to me, but to this community." The crowd was electric, their support palpable. But as Jack left the stage, he noticed someone standing at the back of the room. Reynolds himself? The man's face was a mask of cold fury as he watched the event unfold. Jack met his gaze, unflinching. After the meeting, Reynolds approached Jack outside the community center. The two men stood face to face, the tension thick in the air. "You've got guts, Monroe," Reynolds said, his voice low. "But guts won't save you." Jack crossed his arms. "Neither will fear, Reynolds." "I'm not backing down," Reynolds smirked, leaning in closer. "You think you've won because you've got the town behind you? Let's see how they feel when this all comes crashing down." With that, Reynolds turned and walked away, leaving Jack standing in the cold night air. The warning was clear, but Jack refused to let it rattle him. He had come too far to give up now. The next morning, the fallout from the town hall began to spread. Megan's coverage of the event went viral, drawing attention from outside the community. People from neighboring towns and even larger cities began sharing Jack's story, expressing support and condemning Reynolds. But while the public rallied around Jack, Reynolds made his move. That afternoon, Jack received a call from Linda. Her tone was urgent. "Jack, we've got a problem. What's going on?" Jack asked. "Reynolds' legal team filed a countersuit," Linda said. "They're claiming you've defamed him and damaged his businesses. It's a desperate move, but it complicates things." Jack's stomach sank. "Can we fight it?" "Absolutely," Linda replied. "But it's going to be a long, messy battle. Are you ready for that?" Jack took a deep breath. "I don't have a choice." As the lawsuit unfolded, Jack threw himself into the fight. He worked tirelessly with Linda to build his case, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing for the courtroom battle ahead. The community continued to stand by him, offering their time, resources, and encouragement. But just as Jack began to feel like he was gaining ground, disaster struck again. Late one night, Jack was at the store reviewing paperwork when the fire alarms began to blare. Smoke poured into the room, and Jack rushed outside to see flames consuming the back of the building. The fire spread quickly, and by the time the fire department arrived, half the store was engulfed. Jack stood helplessly in the parking lot, watching everything he had built go up in flames. Claire and the other employees arrived, their faces pale with shock. "Jack, what do we do now?" Claire whispered. Jack's fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and despair. He knew the fire wasn't an accident. This was Reynolds' final attempt to destroy him. But as Jack stared at the burning store, a single thought kept him grounded. This isn't the end. Not for me, and not for this community. Jack stood in the parking lot, the crackling flames reflecting in his eyes. The store, the heart of everything he had been fighting for, was now reduced to ashes. Yet, even as despair tried to creep in, Jack felt an overwhelming surge of resolve. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something greater. The fire department worked tirelessly to extinguish the blaze, but by dawn, the damage was done. The store was a charred husk, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke. The employees stood huddled together, their faces etched with worry. Jack turned to them, his voice steady. "This fire doesn't change anything. We're still standing, and we're going to rebuild. This isn't just my fight. It's ours." Claire stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "We're with you, Jack. No matter what." The employees nodded, their determination matching Jack's. The community, too, rallied around him once again. By mid-morning, volunteers arrived with food, supplies, and donations to help Jack and his team recover. Among them was Megan Carter, her camera in hand. "Jack, the world is watching," she said. "People are outraged. This fire is the last straw." Jack nodded, his jaw set. "Then let's use this moment to end Reynolds' reign for good." Over the next few days, the outpouring of support was overwhelming. Donations poured in from across the country, and Jack set up a crowdfunding campaign to rebuild the store. Within 48 hours, they had raised enough money to not only restore the business but also expand it. Meanwhile, Linda worked tirelessly to push the lawsuit forward. The fire had drawn the attention of law enforcement, and an investigation revealed evidence linking the blaze to Reynolds. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed a car registered to one of Reynolds' employees near the store on the night of the fire. The legal tide had turned. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. Jack sat beside Linda, his heart pounding as witnesses testified about Reynolds' history of intimidation and the mounting evidence against him. The surveillance footage, coupled with the vandalism, threats, and break-ins, painted a damning picture. Reynolds sat at the defense table, his smug demeanor replaced with visible discomfort. When it was his turn to testify, his deflections and denials rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. After weeks of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Reynolds was guilty of harassment, intimidation, and conspiracy to destroy Jack's business. He was ordered to pay significant damages, and his remaining stores were seized as part of the settlement. Reynolds' empire had crumbled, and Jack had won. The victory was bittersweet, but Jack didn't dwell on the past. He focused on the future, channeling his energy into rebuilding the store from the ground up. With the community's support, Brookhaven Market reopened within 6 months, bigger and better than ever. This time, The store wasn't just a business. It was a symbol of resilience, unity, and the power of standing up for what's right. On the day of the grand reopening, the parking lot was packed with customers, volunteers, and friends who had supported Jack throughout his journey. Claire stood beside him, a beaming smile on her face as she handed out flyers. Henry, the elderly man who had always believed in Jack, shook his hand firmly. "You've done it, Jack. You've shown this town what true strength looks like." Jack smiled, looking around at the bustling crowd. "I didn't do it alone. This store belongs to all of us." As the ribbon was cut and the doors swung open, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey had been grueling, but it had been worth every challenge. The store's shelves were stocked, the aisles were full of life, and the community stood stronger than ever. That evening, as Jack locked up the store, he paused to look at the sign above the entrance. "Brookhaven Market, everyone welcome." He smiled, a deep sense of peace washing over him. Reynolds had tried to destroy him, but Jack had turned every setback into a stepping stone. The fire hadn't been the end. It had been the spark that ignited something greater. And as Jack walked into the night, he knew that the real victory wasn't in beating Reynolds. It was in proving that no amount of hatred or greed could ever extinguish the power of kindness, resilience, and community.